This is the MSI Wind U100, a netbook from 2008. The Wind PC, which stands for Wi-Fi Network Device, was MSI's response to the successful Asus EEE PC. It's a small device that packs a medium-sized punch designed for internet use and other lightweight applications.
Surfing the web wherever you are.
See you talking to wherever you are.
Ride with the Wind, MSI Wind Netbook.
It originally launched with a $480 price tag that then quickly got discounted to as low as $350 in stores and even lower through other platforms. I bought this exact one shortly after it released through the Home Shopping Network for just $250, primarily for college since I needed something portable and cheap to take notes on and complete basic assignments. It wasn't designed with playing games in mind, but recently I decided to pull it out of storage and see what it can do, and just what it's capable of when it comes to retro gaming. But before we go any further, let's take a tour around the device and see what it has. On the left side we have the fan exhaust in the center, behind that is the power jack followed by a Kensington lock, and on the other side we have two USB ports. Along the front there are LED indicators for various features. And on the right, we have another USB port, a memory card reader, microphone and speaker ports, VGA, and an Ethernet jack. Moving over to the back, there's a whole lot of nothing, just the screen hinges. Flipping the device over, we see lots of ventilation and two speaker grills, as well as a locking mechanism for the battery release. Opening up the laptop, we have a tiny trackpad with a right and left click bar. The keyboard itself is decently sized and feels pretty nice to type on. In the top right, we have the power button. And for the screen, we have a matte finish 10-inch display, which is nice since it's not very reflective. In the center above the screen is a webcam as well as a microphone on the right side corner. Getting inside requires removing the battery, followed by unscrewing 9 screws, all located on the bottom of the shell of the netbook. Taking a look at some of the inner components, on the right we have the cooling fan, and next to that we have the RAM expansion slot. This netbook originally came with 1 GB of onboard RAM, but I added this extra 1 GB of RAM way back when I first got the laptop to bring it to its maximum capacity of 2 GB. Over on the left is a mini PCIe network card, and directly to the right of it is a 120 GB SSD. The SSD is not an original part. This U100 originally came with an 80 GB Toshiba hard disk drive that died about 6 years ago. More on why I picked this specific drive later. Additionally, the original CMOS battery was also dead when I started this project about 2 months ago, so I replaced it with this new one, but I had to switch the polarity on the JST connector to match the original. As for the main battery, the original 3-cell one that came with this is also completely dead, so I ended up ordering a new 6-cell battery, which is quite a bit larger but matches the original design that MSI had for the larger capacities. Due to its extra height, it has its own rubber feet built in to keep the device from slipping around on a desk. This also causes the whole device to lift up slightly in the back, which I actually think makes for a better typing experience overall. The netbook itself measures just 7 inches in depth and 10 inches in length. When compared to a Steam Deck, I think it's a pretty good size for a portable. Not to mention, it has a larger screen and a ratio that's better suited for retro gaming. Now that we've taken a look at the outside of the device, let's turn it on and take a look at some of its other features. I reinstalled a fresh copy of Windows XP Home Edition since that's what this specific model originally came with. However, there were later models that also supported Windows 7 as well. To install Windows as well as some other software, I used this external DVD drive made by Asus. The placement of the two USB ports on the left was quite convenient for connecting and powering it. Something else I used with this netbook was this Razer Orochi mouse that I bought back in 2009, which had the option for being used either wired or Bluetooth. But I forgot that the U100 had an optional Bluetooth upgrade which I did not opt in for back in 2008, so I ended up having to buy this cheap Bluetooth 4.0 dongle so I could use it. So, for ease of use, I'll be using this mouse for the rest of this video. Taking a look at the processor, the U100 used a dual-core Intel Atom N270 CPU that ran at 1.6 GHz. However, something pretty neat about the Wind PC was that the BIOS allowed the user to overclock the system up to 24%. I did not do that here since I wanted to leave it how it originally was when I bought it. As for the display, it's powered by an Intel GMA 945 GSE Express chipset, whereas the screen has an unusual resolution of 1024 by 600 pixels. Something I found interesting was that many laptops back then let you change the internal GPU's memory usage in BIOS. However, this device did not have that option and started out with just 8 MB of VRAM. But, over time while testing games out, the 8 MB of memory allocation eventually crawled its way up to its maximum of 224 MB of memory, which caused me to re-record some gameplay as it actually got better over time. As for hard drive performance, I picked this CS900 SSD specifically because PNY has software that works on XP called PNY Toolbox, which allows you to see the status of the SSD, make sure trim is working, perform the optimization process on the drive so it continues to run at full speed, as well as view the health of the drive so you know ahead of time when you need to start backing things up. Looking back at the keyboard for a moment, the U100 has a bunch of function combo keys that also allowed the user to turn on or off certain things like the trackpad, Wi-Fi card, and webcam. Speaking of the webcam, I never really used it back when I got this, so when I turned it on to test it out, I was pretty surprised with how good the video quality was since most netbooks back then had pretty terrible webcams. The built-in speakers aren't very good, so I bought these USB-powered Creative Pebble speakers to go with it since I thought they fit the overall rounded look of the U100. For comparison, here's some music playback of the netbook speakers compared to the Pebble speakers. Although I don't remember if it originally came with it, I do know that at some point I had the XP Plus add-on installed, so I went ahead and installed that as well since it comes with some pretty cool themes, as well as a few games I remembered playing on this netbook. And speaking of games, it's time to take a look and see what this beauty can handle. Obviously we can't start without mentioning the Maxis 3D pinball demo that came with Windows XP, which works just fine. The first thing I wanted to test out is if DOSBox ran well on the Wind PC. And for the most part, they ran okay, but I started seeing slowdowns in parts of gameplay that had a lot going on. This was easily fixed by opening the config files within their GOG game folders and removing the scaler option by changing it from normal to X and setting it to none instead. I ended up having to do this to pretty much every DOS game I played through DOSBox, and since the screen is small enough, they didn't really need the upscale anyways and still look great. As for DOS games that I own outside of GOG, I went ahead and created a folder that houses all of their config files in one place and pointed them to a single install of DOSBox. Doing this meant that I wouldn't bloat the drive with dozens of extra copies of DOSBox and set the scaler to none, as well as adjusted each of their cycle speeds so they'd each run their best on this specific machine. Although many of these games can run without DOSBox, doing this for my entire library of DOS games was pretty essential since the U100 does not have very good legacy sound support with its Realtek HD audio drivers, which causes music and effects to sound pretty terrible. Here's an example between the U100 sound card versus DOSBox when playing Descent. And I'm sure we can all agree that playing Duke Nukem 3D without the proper audio would just not be right, as we'd miss out on this amazing soundtrack. Now that we've covered DOSBox, let's move on to 90s games for Windows. It should be no surprise that games from the 90s work on this machine, but it's actually a bit more complicated than that. For the most part, these games have no trouble running on this netbook. However, the odd aspect ratio of the screen means that most games have to be run in 800 by 600 resolution. Additionally, because there's 2 GB of RAM, there's quite a few games that don't want to run. Fortunately, the GOG versions of these games fix a lot of these issues. For example, Mission Force Cyberstorm from the original CD wouldn't open because it said it needed more than 0 MB of RAM. But the GOG version of the game runs without a problem. However, games from GOG running is not always the case either. There are a few games I've tested where trying to run the game simply crashes when using the GOG launcher, but when creating a shortcut to the exe directly from the install folder, work just fine. There are also a bunch of games from GOG that use the N-Glide wrapper for running 3DFX games. The GPU on the U100 doesn't seem to be able to handle it, but for games like Quake here, creating a shortcut to the Windows version hidden in the install folder also tends to work as well. There are also some games that don't work at all. Some of them crash no matter what, both from GOG as well as their original install media. And then there are some games like Diablo and Warcraft 2 that wouldn't even try opening when using the GOG versions, but creating ISOs from my original CDs would work perfectly fine. With all that being said, even though some games don't work, there really isn't a shortage of games that do work on here, even if some of them need a little extra help. It's still very nice having the majority of the games I wanted work in some way or another. But how does the U100 handle games that are a bit more power hungry? I've chosen a handful of games from the early to mid 2000s to showcase here, as this really seems to be the limit of what this netbook can handle. For the most part, games made by Blizzard run very well on here. Diablo 2 has no problems at all and looks pretty good. Warcraft 3 also looks and runs pretty smoothly as well.
Yes, my lord.
Something that's really nice about these two titles is that you can still download their classic installers from the Blizzard website if you own them. Just go to your account settings and scroll down to the bottom of the Games and Subscriptions section of the page. The launchers themselves have some issues, but once you cancel the website download and select a file destination, the installers will download and automatically open when they're done. Taking a look at Return to Castle Wolfenstein, if you set the graphics settings to the lower end, the game is very playable while inside buildings, but starts to show some slowdowns while being out in the open or when you have a lot happening on screen. Another game that seems to work well is Battle Realms. The gameplay is smooth and actually looks very good on this small screen. However, I didn't test it against multiple AI opponents, so I could see this one possibly slowing down when there's a ton going on at once. For Freelancer, it's a mix of good and bad. After finding the best graphics settings, it still has frame rate drops when on stations and when viewing some cutscenes. But when it comes to the actual gameplay, it runs surprisingly well without having to compromise the look of the game too much, which is really what matters the most for this title.
Roger that. Your request to dock is granted. Please proceed to dock 1. Please stand by. We're full at the moment. Your objective uploaded.
As for Republic Commando, even on the lowest settings the game struggles to keep a consistent frame rate. There are some times where it looks good, but for the most part it runs poorly and also shows some graphical issues which doesn't lend to a good gameplay experience.
The only way to take out that gun emplacement is with grenades.
Although I couldn't get Oblivion to run on here at all, I was able to try out Morrowind instead. And it does have its issues. The framerate is inconsistent and can drop pretty low at times, and even when it is playing nicely, there are frequent rendering issues with both distant and nearby objects throughout the starting area of the game.
I suppose I could spare a moment or two.
Yes?
Die, scoundrel!
And then there's Knights of the Old Republic. I had high hopes for this one as it started out running better on here than on one of my previous project PCs. But once I finally got in game, it was immediately obvious that this would not be a good experience. While in areas with little around, it would still slow down when facing directions that have more objects in the world, even if you couldn't see them yet. And the further I got into the game, the more of a slideshow it became, which was a little bit of a disappointment. If you've made it this far into the video, I thank you very much for taking the time joining me while revisiting my old MSI Wind U100 Netbook. I still think it's a fantastic little machine and will be a great way to play some of the games I enjoyed from the past. Did you have a netbook? How was your experience with it? Either way, thank you again for watching, and I hope you have a nice day.